So thank you all for coming. My name is Melinda Jean Stafford, and I'm a beekeeper in a couple of capacities. I manage a couple of my hives, my own personal hives, at my father-in-law's house. So I work with those hives on a regular basis. And then I also work with the hives at Boise State University. At Boise State, we have a student organization called the Bee Team, and they manage 4 hives currently that are on the rooftop of the Student Union building. It's a very interesting place to put hives, but it's perfect for them. There's lots of plants and flowers nearby for them to forage off of. And so I work with those students and help them manage their hives at Boise State. And I love beekeeping for a lot of reasons, not at least of which is honey. Honey is the reason I think a lot of people get into beekeeping. It's tasty, you can use it for lots of different things, and it's pretty rewarding to be able to harvest it. So harvesting, eating, and gifting homegrown honey is really rewarding, and the process of watching your bees bring in nectar and pollen and build up the honey in their hive is really exciting, especially in the months of May, June, and July. The honey in their hives really starts exploding and growing a lot. And so it's really rewarding as a beekeeper to be able to see that. And honestly, nothing says Merry Christmas like giving someone honey that you harvested out of your own hives. So I think that that's a really great way to get into beekeeping and a reason a lot of people do. So these are the topics that I want to cover today. So first I want to address the question of what is honey? So it's created from nectar, but what exactly is it? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the harvesting process. So how do you remove the frames of honey from a hive? What steps are involved there? What tools do you need for extraction? And we're going to be extracting honey live today, which will be a lot of fun. So all the tools that you need are right here, and we'll go through that. The extraction process, so what steps do you need to take to get the honey out of the frames and into jars? Some general tips and tricks. So what are some good pieces of advice that would help you do this successfully? And then we'll definitely leave some time at the end for Q&A. So first, let's address what is honey. So honey is created when worker bees gather and store nectar from flowers. And bees store it in an organ that they have called their honey stomach. It's an organ that they can collect it in, but then regurgitate from. So the worker bees, which are all female, they go out into fields, onto flowers, into trees, anything that blooms, and they gather nectar, which is a real sweet, watery substance that it's inside flowers. And they store it in their honey stomach, they return to the hive, and they pass that nectar off to house bees, which are also worker bees, also female, that are in the hive. And those worker bees will chew it up like bubble gum and process it a little bit, and then they'll deposit it in the little hexagonal cells inside of their hive. And they'll store it there to dry out and cure. Nectar is very, very watery, and honey is a lot thicker, so it has to dry out and cure to become honey. So a fun fact, a worker bee might visit up to 1,500 flowers to fill up their honey stomach just once. So the amount of flowers that are needed to fill up a honey stomach is massive, let alone fill up a single cell, let alone fill up a hive. So that's why years like this year, where we had a really early spring, things dried out really early, was not the best honey season. At Boise State, 2 years ago, we harvested about 200 pounds of honey, and this year we only harvested about 100. So it's about half of what we harvested the prior year because flowers were in bloom so early when the hive's population wasn't at its peak. You want things in bloom when your hive's population is at its peak. So those combination of factors really make a difference in the amount of honey that your bees can store in any given year. So some years will be great, some years will not be good. This was a pretty mediocre or low year across the Treasure Valley at least. Then the question becomes, well, do I have enough to harvest? So how many of you currently have hives? Cool, awesome, so there's a few of you. So you look into your hive and you see that there's some honey, but how do you know that you have enough to harvest? So this is a picture from the rooftop at Boise State. These are a couple of the students on the bee team that are working with the hives. And you will notice in this picture that we're using boxes that are all fairly large. There's a couple sizes of boxes that beekeepers use. For the sake of this conversation, we'll call them deeps and mediums. At Boise State, we run all deeps. They're all the larger boxes. The general rule of thumb is you want your bees to be able to store up enough honey and pollen and have enough space for eggs to fill up 2 brood boxes. So for example, on Hive 1, you can see we have an additional box. So that additional box is what we can harvest from. So we want to make sure that they have enough space to fill up 2 of those boxes before we harvest anything. So you can see Hive 5 has 2 additional honey supers. Honey super is the term that we use for the boxes that store honey. They're the same as the other boxes. We just call them something different because they have honey in them. Yes, sir?
Where is the queen at?
So the queen bee, where is she at? She's generally in the lower part of the hive where most of the eggs are, because she's the one that lays the eggs. So the honey is going to be up in the top. So again, to answer the question of do you have enough to harvest, you want to look at how much you have in excess to 2 deep boxes worth. And if you're using boxes that have 10 frames, that's 20 frames. And if you're using those types of boxes, you want to make sure that you're leaving 7 to 8 frames worth of honey in that mix of 2 boxes. Okay, so you have enough to harvest. So maybe you have 2 deeps worth of baby bees and pollen and honey. And so you have some honey in excess to that. Well, how do you know that you're harvesting honey and not brood? Brood is the term that we use for baby bees, whether they're in the egg stage, the larva stage, or the pupa stage. Brood is that cumulative term that we use for baby bees. So when I'm harvesting honey, I want to make sure I'm not harvesting brood. Unless you like a little bit of bite to your honey, it's not really what most people want. So you want to make sure you're collecting frames that just have honey in it. So how do you know? An experienced beekeeper, or even a beekeeper that's been doing it for a season or 2, can generally pull up a frame and tell whether or not it has honey on it or honey and brood. For those of you that can't tell the difference as easily, or just want to know for sure that you're harvesting just honey frames, there's an easy trick to that, which is using a tool that we call a queen excluder. It's hard to see in this photo because it's very thin, but it's a metal grid that fits between your brood boxes, those first 2 boxes, and the boxes above it. The grid is metal or plastic and is small enough that the queen can't get through. And because the queen can't get through, you know that there's not going to be eggs in the upper portion because she's the only one that lays the eggs. But the worker bees that are smaller can fit through. And so they can get into those upper boxes and store honey there, but you know you will not have eggs. Some beekeepers do not like to use these. And so they choose to not use them, and then they can determine which frames have just honey on them, and that works well for them. But for new beekeepers, this is a tool that can be really helpful. So then the question becomes, well, how do I get the bees off of my frames so that I can successfully harvest the honey? So this is a video of Jake, one of the students on the bee team, and he, in this video, is going to use his hive tool to pull the frame of honey out of the honey super here. And you'll notice when he pulls this frame out that there's going to be bees on it. And what Jake's going to use is a nylon brush that looks just like this. And this nylon brush has really soft bristles, and he's going to use this brush to gently brush the bees off of the frame. This is a really cheap and easy way to get the bees off of your frames so that you can take them inside to harvest the honey off of them. So I will pass this around. So you'll notice right here, he's going to move it over, and then our other friend Tasha is using that brush to gently scrape and brush those bees off of the frames. And then what they're going to do is quickly take that frame and move it indoors with no bees on it and store it in there where the bees can't get back to the frame. Yes, ma'am?
Shouldn't he be wearing gloves?
It's up to each individual. So the question was, should he be wearing gloves? I like to wear gloves because when I get stung, I swell up for a couple of days, and it's pretty inconvenient typing on a computer with a giant club hand. That doesn't mean I have an allergy, but it does mean that it's inconvenient. So I prefer to wear gloves to prevent that. Jake in this video has very little reaction when he gets stung, and actually I prefer to not wear gloves if I didn't react as poorly as I do, but with no gloves you can feel what you're touching a lot easier, especially with honey. You start getting into honey and your gloves get really sticky and it can get pretty messy. So going gloveless is preferred if you are a good beekeeper and can manage without getting too many stings, which is totally doable. So going gloveless is a lot easier when pulling frames out. Some beekeepers that have a little more money to play with can invest in tools like a bee blower, which is very similar to a leaf blower but with a smaller engine that blows air more gently. That's helpful if you have a lot of hives, but not necessarily helpful if you are on a smaller budget and only working with a couple of hives. So I think the nylon brush is the way to go. And you can get those at D&B, you can get them through other hive retailers, and you can also get a similar product at probably a hardware store. You just want to get something that has soft bristles.